Perhaps no other issue has shaped post-World War II Middle East like the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 and the subsequent expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians has caused an enmity that is still visible to the present day. The issue has been so central that all the prominent strains of ideological thought which dominated the region in the second half of the 20th century have addressed it, whether it was nationalism, pan-Arabism, or Islamism. The conflict has led to numerous major wars and has repeatedly needed the world's superpowers to step in and mediate.
Contrary to popular opinion, this conflict is not thousands of years old. Its roots can be traced to the beginning of the 20th century. Like most political issues in the Middle East, European imperial powers helped sow the seeds of future conflict through their policies, especially in the Mandate period. But since then,
through various twists and turns, Palestine and Israel have gone on to experience very different fates, with the dreams and aspirations of one moving further away from reality, whilst the other is moving towards its manifestation.
Palestine had been ruled by the Ottomans since the start of the 16th century. Its population was predominantly Arab, both Muslim and Christian. But in the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire began to sharply decline. European powers gained numerous concessions from the Ottomans as they focused on trying to stop the rot at the center of their administration with the Tanzimat reforms. At the same time in Russia, Tsar Alexander III reversed some of his father's liberal reforms and enacted his goal of Russification on his subjects. This attempted to homogenize the empire's citizens by promoting the Russian language and Eastern Orthodox Christian Church. Naturally, this came at the discrimination of all other languages and religions professed. The biggest concentration of Jews at the time would have been in Russia, and as a result, they saw a sharp deterioration of their standard of life. Alexander III's policy seemingly encouraged anti-Semitism as Jews experienced numerous pogroms or violent riots. So, many decided to immigrate, mostly to America, but some small groups also made aliyot, Jewish migration to Ottoman Palestine. In the backdrop of these major geopolitical issues, Jewish intellectuals in Europe were clamoring for a homeland. 19th century Europe was galvanized by nationalism, and it had an ideological influence on European Jewry. In the 1890s, Theodor Herzl formed the Zionist organization, which sought to establish a home in Palestine for Jews. It should be stated that at this point, Zionism was a fringe ideology amongst Jews. Most were either indifferent or preferred assimilating to the societies they inhabited. Zionism might not have had the numbers it needed, but it did have clout, with many Zionists holding prominence in various Western countries like Britain and America. These Zionists would have their prayers answered when the powers of Europe descended into the chaotic First World War.
During World War I, the British carried out 3 different acts of diplomacy which would eventually sow the seeds of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The first of these took place from July 1915 to March 1916, when the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, exchanged a series of letters with the prominent Arab leader and Sharif of Mecca, Hussein ibn Ali. In what is now referred to as the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence, the British government promised support for an independent Arab state if the Arabs would assist the Allies in opposing the Ottoman Empire. At the time, the Ottomans still ruled huge portions of the Arab world. The agreed-upon state would have been a hugely ambitious project, encompassing an area running from the Anatolian Peninsula in the north to the Mediterranean Sea in the west, to Persia in the east, and the Arabian Sea in the south. For the British, the prospect of a prominent Muslim leader such as Sharif Hussein being on their side against the Ottomans was invaluable. The Ottoman Caliph's call for a jihad against the Allies would have been especially worrisome to the British, considering India, their prize colony, was home to more than 60 million Muslims who would naturally have their loyalties aligned to the Caliph in Istanbul. The Sharif, buoyed by the hope of independence, kept his end of the bargain, spearheading the Arab revolt against the Ottomans in the Hijaz, Transjordan, and Syria from 1916 until the end of the war in 1918. The British backed the Sharif in his fight by providing military assistance. The famed T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, served as a liaison between the British and Arab armies. For their part, the British seemed to have little or no intention to follow up on their promise. At the same time as they were courting the Arabs, the British were conducting backdoor negotiations with its wartime allies about the eventual partition of the Ottoman territories in the Middle East, should they triumph. In May 1916, the British government ratified the now infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement, a secret treaty between Britain and France with the partial involvement of Italy and Russia, which demarcated and clearly defined their respective zones of influence in the region. These plans naturally ran contrary to the promise of an independent Arab state, since these zones would have fallen within the remit of the state promised to the Arabs. The details of the Sykes-Picot Agreement were eventually made public by the Bolsheviks in November 1917, consequently causing a great degree of Arab distrust of the Allies, a distrust which would only grow from that point onwards. To further confuse the situation, a few weeks before the world found out about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, issued the Balfour Declaration. This was a statement of support from the British government for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Balfour had written this in a letter to Lord Rothschild, a prominent Jewish Zionist leader. The British hoped that this promise would persuade important members of the Jewish community in America and even in Russia to throw the full weight of their support on the Allied war effort. Zionist hopes were certainly raised by the declaration. Jews had been migrating in significant numbers to Palestine since the turn of the 20th century in order to escape persecution in Eastern Europe. In terms of what this meant for the Arabs already living there, the declaration did mention that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. But that didn't change the fact that the British promise to the Zionists was certainly in contravention to the Hussein McMahon Correspondence, as the territory of Palestine was considered to be within the limits of the Arab independent state promised to the Sharif of Mecca. Not to forget, Palestine was culturally an integral part of the Arab world, so losing that territory to the Zionists would have horrified Arab nationalists. It's important to remember that in this period, Arab nationalism was starting to become an ideological powerhouse in the region. To demonstrate the puzzling nature of British diplomacy towards the Middle East in World War I, the Balfour Declaration was actually in contradiction to the Sykes-Picot Agreement as well, since Zionist considerations were not taken into account in the secret treaty between Britain and France.
Once World War I finished with an Allied victory, the British and French put their Sykes-Picot plan into action through the mandate system. Palestine came under British control. Britain created an impossible task for itself of trying to make both the Arabs and Jews happy. Right from the start, the Arabs felt that they were getting the shorter end of the stick in comparison to the Jews, pointing to the fact that Herbert Samuel, the first High Commissioner of Mandatory Palestine, was a British Jewish Zionist. It's really in the mandate period that the region's demographic makeup changes. with massive numbers of Jews now calling Palestine their home. Prior to the Russian pogroms of the late 19th century, there were very few Jews living in the area. Those who escaped the Tsar's brutality boasted the number of Jews in Palestine to constitute around 10% of the population by the start of the Mandate period in 1920. But by the end of World War II, just 25 years later, due to substantial Jewish migration away from Europe, Jews accounted for almost a third of Palestine's population.
To compound matters, Arabs did not feel their views were being sufficiently represented by the British High Commissioner, whilst mass Jewish immigration to Palestine continued unabated and Jewish economic power continued to grow. The Arabs, dismayed by all of this, revolted in 1936, but by 1939 it was harshly repressed. The Great Revolt, as Palestinians like to call it, actually had pretty far-reaching consequences. In order to quell the unrest, the British worked with Zionist military groups like the Haganah. This military experience would prove pivotal for the Zionists in the eventual 1948 war. In addition, the British tried to placate the Arabs with the 1939 White Paper, which capped Jewish immigration into Palestine. But if you know your history, this was probably the worst time to do that, thus making the Zionists even more militant.
All the while, relations between Jews and Arabs worsened in Palestine.
World War II proved to be particularly important for the future of Palestine. Certain Zionist groups such as Irgun had initiated an insurgency against the British authorities, the bombing of the King David Hotel in 1946 being the most famous example. At the same time, the Arabs were still unhappy with the lack of prospects for self-governance. Feeling unable to deal with a problem it had created, in 1947 Britain stated its desire to terminate its mandate and passed the Palestine question to the newly created United Nations. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the persecution faced by the Jews at the hands of the Nazis in Europe certainly won the Zionist cause a great deal of sympathy in the international arena. In late 1947, the United Nations announced its plan to partition Palestine into an Arab and Jewish state. The Arabs were absolutely furious, whilst the Zionists rejoiced for the most part. The very next day, a civil war erupted between the two sides that would see itself metamorphosize into a war between the newly established Israel and several Arab states who invaded in May 1948. By early 1949, Israel had emerged victorious against its numerous foes. The war is remembered in Israel as the War of Independence, whilst Palestinians remember the conflict as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. Seen as a low point in Palestinian history, it is an appropriate name considering some 750,000 of them were forced to flee their homes. Israel gained a further 60% of the area proposed for an Arab state by the UN, and then went on to pass the Law of Return in 1950, which over the next few decades allowed over 1 million Jews around the world, especially Muslim countries, the right to gain Israeli citizenship. The territory not conquered by Israel was the West Bank and East Jerusalem, both of which were annexed by Jordan, whilst Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip. Crucially, Israel had only signed armistice agreements with the Arab states in 1949. With the absence of peace treaties, the prospect of war always loomed large. There would be 3 more major Arab-Israeli wars. The first of which, the 1956 Suez Crisis, saw Britain, France, and Israel try to unsuccessfully gang up on Jamal Abdel Nasser's Egypt. In the 1950s and 60s, ideas of pan-Arabism became hugely popular, Nasser being seen as its charismatically defiant leader, and so the cause of Palestine was left to its Arab brethren. The problem was, oftentimes the other Arab leaders were looking at it from the perspective of their own national interests. It was only in the aftermath of Israel's stunning victory in the Six-Day War of 1967 that the Palestinians really tried to instrumentalize their own agency and take center stage on the political scene. Already in 1964, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, had been created as an umbrella organization with various activist militant groups, all united by the aim to liberate Palestine. Key nationalist militant groups, calling themselves Fedayeen, included Yasser Arafat-led Fatah and the PFLP headed by George Habash. Initially, the insurgents attacked Israeli targets from within the occupied territories, bearing in mind that the West Bank and the Gaza Strip had both been overtaken by the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, during the Six-Day War. But that quickly proved to be unfeasible, as the IDF sharply cracked down on their activity. Then the PLO moved their bases to neighboring Jordan, enjoying great success in raising the profile of the Palestinian armed struggle and attracting increased numbers of recruits. In the process, the Fedayeen brandished themselves as freedom fighters and tried to get the world to pay attention to the Palestinians' plight by carrying out brazen operations like hijacking civilian airplanes. In fact, the PLO became so powerful that it was likened to a state within a state in Jordan. To neutralize the threat to his sovereignty, in 1970 King Hussein of Jordan ordered the Jordanian forces to attack the PLO in an event known as Black September. The ultimate trigger for this was actually the Dawson's Field hijackings by the PFLP. The name Black September was then co-opted by a new Fedayeen group which decided to escalate the level of violence used. This is best exemplified by their attack at the 1972 Munich Olympics. By 1971, the PLO had been kicked out of Jordan and relocated to southern Lebanon, which they used as a base to strike Israel. Lebanon was a fractured country at that point, and the PLO asserted themselves as key players within its domestic politics. In 1975, a messy civil war erupted which the PLO was involved at the heart of. 3 years later, Israel invaded southern Lebanon, having had enough of Fedayeen attacks on its soil. They would be forced to get involved in the country once again in 1982, when their second invasion of Lebanon forced the PLO out of the country. All the while this was happening, the enmity between Israel and its Arab neighbors had not subsided. In 1973, Syria and Egypt attacked Israel. Whilst there was certainly no victory for the Arabs, they did surprisingly well relative to their previous performances. But Nasser's successor, Anwar Sadat, was keen to normalize relations with his Jewish neighbor, to whom Egypt had lost control of the Sinai Peninsula during the course of the Six-Day War. In 1978, the two former foes came together at the Camp David Accords, mediated by American President Carter. The Egyptians agreed to recognize the State of Israel, and Israel agreed to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. Subsequently, President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin of Israel both won the Nobel Peace Prize. The Arab world, however, was shocked. Its leader, Egypt, was judged to have made a deal with the enemy and sold the Palestinians out, consequently being kicked out of the Arab League. Sadat would pay for the Camp David Accords with his life, being assassinated in 1981 by an Egyptian Islamist. As for the Palestinians, their struggle had become well publicized, but yet they had little to show for it. By the beginning of the 1980s, they remained stateless, much of them being scattered around the Arab world with refugee status. Israel, on the other hand, had gone from fighting for its survival to being in a relatively comfortable position against its foes. It's often the case that negotiations take place only once one side is overwhelmingly dominant. Having thus achieved the upper hand against its numerous Arab foes, in the space of 15 years between the late 70s and the mid-90s, Israel would go on to sign peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan, and even signed agreements with the PLO. This transition was also reflected in its internal developments as well. As its external worries lessened, so too did the need for a state-controlled economy. From the 1970s onwards, Israel experienced a shift towards free market reforms that saw its economy become more liberalized.
In the years since, the Palestinian political scene has changed greatly. From the 1980s onwards, the PLO lost their preeminence within Palestinian politics as they were forced abroad to Tunisia after the Israelis kicked them out of Lebanon. When the first Intifada broke out in 1987, it was spearheaded by local leadership. The secularist tone of the PLO was also replaced by Islamist rhetoric, which not only highlighted the need to reclaim Palestinian nationhood, but also the Islamic importance of Palestine within the Muslim imagination. Hamas has become a torchbearer for Palestinian Islamists and has been a protagonist in numerous conflicts with Israel until the present time. Even though Palestinian territories have been under Israeli occupation since the Six-Day War of 1967, in the aftermath of the historic Oslo Accords between Israel and the PLO in 1993, some governance administration has been handed back to the Palestinian National Authority. But these are limited and seemingly worthless, as Israel has shown itself to flout international law on numerous occasions, restricting the movements of Palestinians and imposing harsh blockades in Gaza, all the while continuing to sanction the construction of illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank. All this has culminated in many people denouncing Israel for what they view as apartheid policies. The conflict recently reached a crescendo of violence as Israel waged a two-pronged war against Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon. In recent decades, the Shia militant group Hezbollah and its sponsor Iran have become more involved in the conflict, providing supplies and support to Hamas. The most recent development in the long Israeli-Palestinian conflict is US President Donald Trump's plan for America to take over the Gaza Strip and displace over 2 million Palestinians from their own territory, so that the area can be developed into some sort of real estate project. One thing is for sure though, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is far from over.
Thank you guys for watching. I want to thank my patrons for always supporting. If you want to financially support Hikmah History, there's a link to my Patreon in the description to this video. Until next time, peace.